Last class we touched upon the cultural differences between the Czechs and the Slovaks, which leads us to your assigned reading on how the Czechs and Slovaks became one country. Okay, so Czechoslovakia became a country in November of 1918, just after World War I. Prior to that, the Czechs and Slovaks had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for 4 centuries. It was also known as the Habsburg Empire because of the Habsburg royal family. The breakup of the Habsburg Empire after World War I arose because of their war on Serbia in July 1915, which began World War I. So, in a way, the creation of Czechoslovakia was punishment for the Habsburg aggression. The creation of Czechoslovakia didn't mean that only Czechs and Slovaks lived there. Germans, Hungarians, and Poles were also part of this newly created country. As usual for countries whose lines are randomly drawn up, ethnic problems were created. The loss of the area was significant for the Habsburg Empire because most of its industry was in the area that became Czechoslovakia. The provisional government was known as the First Republic, and as you probably read, lasted until 1938. We'll get to what happened after 1938 in the next class. Okay, so back to the first government of Czechoslovakia. The new government was modeled after the parliamentary democratic government of France. Parliament held most of the power. They had a president, but the president answered to Parliament. The first Czechoslovakian president was Thomas Masaryk. He was elected by the National Assembly, as their parliament was known. Now, Masaryk was an interesting character. He was a blacksmith and later a philosophy professor at the University of Prague. He was a politician in the Austrian parliament, but he actually fled the Habsburg Empire to avoid being tried for treason. Ultimately, he went to England, where he voiced his support for Czech independence. Masaryk held the office of president until 1935. That's 27 years, a long time by our standards. I think it's telling that Czechoslovakia's first president was a Czech. Although he was popular, his Czech background most likely didn't win him any friends among the other main groups in the country, the Slovaks, Germans, Poles, and Hungarians. However, the Czechs were the majority of the country, with Slovaks being second. The new government only had representatives who were Czech and Slovak. Now then, this new government had a huge job ahead. They had to secure the country's boundaries, develop a central administration, and write a constitution. They also had to deal with an impoverished and war-stricken population. The boundaries around Slovakia were hard to establish because the Hungarians disputed them. Hungary wanted the Slovak area, so the new government already had a problem on its hands. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia made a bigger mess. The Bolsheviks tried to claim Hungary and then Slovakia as Soviet republics. Their attempt failed with intervention by the allies of Western Europe and by the Czechoslovakian and Romanian armies. The Treaty of Trianon in June 1920 eventually settled, at least legally, most of the disputes about Czechoslovakia's boundaries. The assigned reading on these border disputes may have reminded you of siblings who have to share a room and are always arguing over which side of the room is whose. This kind of thing often takes place when boundaries are arbitrarily drawn. Sometimes these disputes last for years. And not to give away the rest of the country's history, but as many of you know, it is no longer a single country, but 2. These are the lasting effects of boundary issues. And unlike children's boundary issues, those between countries have serious consequences, including war. Czechs and Slovaks predominated in the new country, but that didn't mean they were doing that well economically. Most Czechs and Slovaks were poor. Some worked in industry, factories, but many were poor peasant farmers. There was plenty of, resentment towards other groups, the Germans and Hungarians, who owned most of the land and businesses. The Bolshevik Revolution of neighboring Russia had some effect on the Czechs and Slovaks, who thought they could also start a revolution to break out of poverty. The Czechoslovakian government took their concerns seriously and made some radical reforms, such as imposing limitations to the amount of land that could be owned and cutting the workday down to 8 hours. Other reforms included health and accident insurance, training, and pensions. These reforms were quite radical in Europe at the time.